Today in the studio, we're going to show you how to lower your MagneRide Equipped 2018 Mustang with help from Ford Performance. These Ford Performance springs will be a direct replacement for the factory springs on all 2015 through 2018 GT350s. Because the 2018 Mustang GT with the optional MagneRide suspension shares a lot of the GT350 suspension, these springs will fit those as well. You're going to be a direct replacement and lower the car approximately 3/4 of an inch. For this installation, let a lift and a pull jack or a jack and jack stands, 3/8 ratchet, 10mm socket, 13mm socket, 15mm socket, 18mm socket, 19mm socket, 1/2 inch ratchet, 21mm socket, 24mm socket, torque wrench, 17mm wrench, clip removal tool, hammer, and a spring compressor. Now, if you've done lowering springs on a 2015 through 2017 Mustang in the past, the process is going to be pretty similar. It's actually almost the same. There's a couple things you just have to be careful with. For starters, you have the wiring going here, which is part of the MagneRide control. This will actually come off with the shock. Just make sure this wire doesn't get bound anywhere. The same thing for the leveling sensor on the control, which we'll point out a little bit later. You want to make sure that doesn't get stretched too far, it can get damaged. Now, to remove the wrist spring will require us to lower down the subframe. So you want to do it one side at a time so the subframe doesn't move around too much. But to be able to move it down, what we're going to do is remove these two bolts here to disconnect the shock and this bolt here. So we can disconnect the brake line to give us more movement downward. Okay, now we can move under the car. Well, like I mentioned earlier, you will have to lower down the subframe to get the spring out. So first thing you're going to do, get a jack or a pull jack to support it so we can remove the 4 bolts and lower it down. Now to remove the subframe, we'll start in the front with this bracket. You're going to remove these two 13s here and then remove the larger bolt here. Now you want to lower your jack or pull jack down so you can remove the spring. Now you want to be careful at this point here. This is your MagneRide sensor back here on the control arm. This will actually move down as one piece, so there's no reason to worry about it. You're not going to overextend it, nothing like that. Just be careful of it. It is kind of small and fragile. You don't want to hit it with the spring too hard when you remove it. The rear springs are going to be unique on the MagneRide cars, which includes the 2018 with the option or the Shelby cars. What's unique about them is the springs are actually specific left to right. They're wound in opposite directions for your left and right spring, so you want to make sure when you grab the replacement spring, you do grab the correct one. Ford has a very small L at the end of the part number for the left and an R for the right. Move the factory spring isolator and move it over to the new springs, then turn it, lock it in position, and then we can install it. Now be careful with the ABS line and the shock. Again, don't put too much strain on this harness here. You can pull these aside and bring the spring right in here from the front. Now the spring's seated in the lower control arm. What you want to do is turn it, and there's actually a stop. It'll fit into the factory isolator at the bottom, and I'll turn until it stops. Just double check, make sure the spring is against the stop. You can actually see it right through here. And we can push it down onto the top perch. Okay, now we can jack the subframe back up into place and then reinstall the bolts. Put the bolt up into place. You want to start these by hand. Make sure you get them threaded in. And do the same with the front. The subframe bolt's snug. Now we're going to torque them to the factory spec, which is 129 foot-pounds. Now you push the shock back in place under the studs and reinstall the hardware. Put the brake line bracket back into place and reinstall the bolt. And repeat the process on the other side. We're going to move on to the fronts. We're going to start the process under the hood. What you want to do is remove 2 of these bolts, leave the third one, just loosen it up, and then we'll go down in the actual wheel well and remove the strut. So moving on to the front, again, it's going to be very similar to what we did with the S550 Mustang. The difference, again, with this car is the MagneRide suspension. So you want to be careful. This line here, you want to make sure you disconnect it from the strut, and then also unplug it from the back before you try to remove the strut, or you'll damage the MagneRide. Now, since we are disconnecting sensors, at this point, I would disconnect your battery before you begin the front strut removal. Now, the first step in removing the strut, we're going to remove the caliper from the bracket and then put it out of the way. With the caliper off, now we're going to remove this bolt here. It gives us enough flex in the line to put it back here on the K-member out of the way. This is the plug here I was talking about earlier. I'm going to separate this and then actually remove the clips so it'll get tied up when we pull the strut off the car. Now on the front part of the strut, we disconnect the clips for the MagneRide plug along with the ABS. Push them out of the way. I have the sensor wires disconnected. Now we're going to remove the sway bar. I'm going to put a wrench on the back and then take the nut off the front. Right here is the ride height sensor for the MagneRide for the front. Now what we have to do when the strut comes off, the spindle comes down pretty far and we'll actually max this out. We don't want to put too much tension on this because they are expensive to replace. So we're just going to remove this nut right here and let that hang, making it easier to remove the strut. And now the last step in the process is to remove the actual spindle bolts. And what we're going to do is remove these nuts, just get them to the end of the bolt, and then we're going to have a hammer and hammer them through to remove them. Now with the bolts and splines hammered through, we can remove the nuts and bolts and then separate the spindle from the strut. All right, now with the strut on the table, the next part of the installation is going to require a coil spring compressor. Now, if you don't have one of these, you can rent one from most local auto parts stores. What we have to do now, though, is compress the spring and then remove the strut mount and swap the springs over. Now with the compress, remove the nut off the top. Now when installing the new spring, you actually will not need a compressor because the spring is lower. We can put it in place and push it down with the strut mount. Now the spring will seat in a certain location, so make sure it is seated in the lower mount. Our assembly is ready to go back in the car. All right, now we can lift the spindle back up and reinstall the bolts to hold the strut to the spindle. Now you want to torque these bolts to 184 pound-feet. All right, the spindle mounted, now we're going to reconnect all of our lines. And don't forget to plug the MagneRide sensor in. So now we can rebolt the sensor on the bottom of the control arm. Reconnect the sway bar end link now. All right, and finally we can install the rotor, caliper, and the bracket. All right, now back up in the engine bay, we can tighten down the strut nuts. And you're going to want to torque these to 46 pound-feet. Anyway, reconnect your battery, reinstall your wheels and tires, and your installation's finished. While definitely not slam, the 3/4 inch drop from the Ford Performance lowering springs will work great with the MagneRide suspension and gets rid of a lot of our wheel gap as well. The installation is pretty straightforward. Give yourself about 2 to 3 hours, be back on the road in no time.